Here's a truth most people don't want to accept. People don't come back because you loved them more. They come back because you stopped needing them. The moment you make someone your emotional center, you lose your edge. And the moment you take that energy back, you become magnetic again. Emotional uncertainty is one of the most powerful psychological forces behind attachment, yet most people misunderstand it. Human beings are not wired to become deeply attached to what is completely predictable. When everything is certain, consistent texts, constant availability, predictable behavior, the mind relaxes and stops assigning high value to the interaction. There is no tension, no anticipation, no emotional spike. But when someone introduces uncertainty, sometimes present, sometimes distant, sometimes warm, sometimes neutral, it activates a different part of the brain. The mind begins to search for patterns, for meaning, for answers. This is where attachment starts to form, not from stability alone, but from the emotional variation that keeps a person mentally engaged. This dynamic is closely tied to how dopamine works in the brain. Dopamine is not just released when you receive something pleasurable. It is released in higher amounts when the reward is uncertain. When attention, affection, or validation is inconsistent, the brain treats it like a variable reward system. This is the same mechanism that makes gambling addictive. Unpredictable outcomes keep people hooked far more than guaranteed ones. In relationships, when someone doesn't always respond the same way or doesn't always give the same level of attention, it creates a loop where the other person keeps investing more energy trying to win that emotional reward again. Over time, this effort turns into attachment because the brain associates that person with both tension and relief. Emotional uncertainty also triggers deeper psychological investment because it challenges a person's sense of control. When someone is fully predictable, there is nothing to figure out. But when their behavior shifts, even slightly, it creates questions. Why did they pull back? Did I do something wrong? What changed? These questions don't just stay at the surface. They occupy mental space repeatedly. The more someone thinks about another person, the more emotionally involved they become. This is why uncertainty often leads to overanalysis, replaying conversations, and trying to interpret small details. The mind becomes focused on solving the puzzle, and that focus strengthens the emotional connection. At a deeper level, emotional uncertainty can also tap into a person's need for validation. When someone is not consistently giving approval or affection, it creates a subtle sense of challenge. People start to seek that validation more intensely because it feels less guaranteed. When they do receive it, even in small amounts, it feels more rewarding because it wasn't certain. This creates a cycle where the person becomes more invested in earning that attention again. It's not necessarily about the other person being better or more compatible. It's about how their unpredictability amplifies the perceived value of their attention. However, this doesn't mean emotional uncertainty is about playing manipulative games or being intentionally confusing. There's a difference between natural emotional independence and forced inconsistency. Genuine uncertainty comes from someone being focused on their own life, not constantly seeking validation, and not reacting to every situation emotionally. Their behavior isn't designed to create confusion. It simply reflects that they are not overly attached or dependent. This naturally creates space, and that space introduces a level of unpredictability that keeps the dynamic engaging without being forced or artificial. Over time, this pattern shapes how people perceive attraction and value. When someone is always available, always accommodating, and always seeking to maintain connection, they remove the element of uncertainty entirely. Without that, the emotional intensity drops, and so does the sense of urgency or desire. But when there is a balance, where connection exists but is not guaranteed at every moment, the mind stays engaged. It continues to anticipate, to wonder, and to invest. That ongoing mental and emotional investment is what gradually turns simple interest into something much deeper, often mistaken for strong emotional attachment or even addiction to the person. The scarcity principle is one of the most consistent psychological drivers of attraction and perceived value. People are naturally drawn to what feels limited, not because the thing itself is objectively better, but because limited access signals importance. When something is always available, always accessible, and always within reach, the mind stops assigning urgency or significance to it. It becomes normal, expected, and eventually taken for granted. But when access is restricted, when time, attention, or emotional availability is not freely given, the brain interprets that limitation as a sign of higher value. This is not a conscious calculation, it's an automatic response rooted in how humans evaluate worth through availability. In relationships, this plays out through behavior more than words. When someone is constantly present, always replying instantly, always making themselves available regardless of circumstances, they unintentionally communicate that their time and attention are abundant and easily given. There is no sense of selectiveness, no sense of priority, and no sense of earned access. On the other hand, when someone has clear boundaries around their time and energy, when they are engaged in their own life and not always immediately accessible, it creates a subtle but powerful shift in perception. Their attention starts to feel like something that has to be valued rather than something that can be assumed. This doesn't require arrogance or deliberate withdrawal. It simply comes from having a life that does not revolve around one person. Scarcity also amplifies emotional impact because of contrast. When attention is not constant, each interaction carries more weight. A message, a call, or time spent together feels more significant because it is not part of an endless stream of availability. The mind begins to associate those moments with higher emotional value, not because they are objectively different, but because they are less frequent and less predictable. This contrast creates a stronger impression, and stronger impressions lead to deeper emotional memory. Over time, this builds a sense of importance around the person providing that limited access. Another layer of the scarcity principle is how it influences effort and investment. People tend to value what they have to work for more than what comes easily. When access to someone's attention or approval is not guaranteed, it naturally increases the level of effort the other person is willing to invest. They pay more attention, they become more intentional, and they start to prioritize the connection. This increased investment is often mistaken for stronger feelings, when in reality, it is the result of the conditions created by scarcity. The more someone invests, emotionally or mentally, the more attached they become because they have something at stake. Scarcity is also closely tied to self-perception. Someone who does not give unlimited access to their time and energy is often perceived as having higher self-worth. Their behavior signals that they have standards, priorities, and a life that demands their attention. This naturally positions them as someone whose presence is valuable, not because they claim it, but because they demonstrate it through how they allocate their attention. In contrast, someone who overextends themselves in an attempt to maintain connection often sends the opposite signal, even if their intentions are genuine. What makes the scarcity principle effective is that it does not rely on manipulation or artificial behavior when it is rooted in authenticity. It emerges naturally when a person is focused on their own growth, responsibilities, and purpose. Their time becomes limited not as a strategy, but as a byproduct of a full life. This creates a dynamic where their attention feels intentional rather than automatic, and that intention is what gives it weight. When people sense that they are not the center of someone's world, but still receive moments of genuine attention, it creates a balance of desire and respect that keeps them engaged and invested in the connection. Self-worth reflection is a central force in attraction because people are not only drawn to others, they are drawn to what those people make them feel about themselves. Every interaction in a relationship acts like a mirror, subtly reflecting back a sense of value, importance, and identity. When someone carries strong internal self-worth, it shows in how they speak, how they set boundaries, how they respond to pressure, and what they tolerate. This doesn't need to be announced or explained, it is communicated through behavior. And when others interact with that energy, they begin to feel it as well. They feel either elevated by it or confronted by it, depending on their own internal state. But in both cases, it creates a strong psychological impact that goes beyond surface-level attraction. People often assume attraction is about looks, charm, or effort, but a large part of it comes from alignment with identity. When someone encounters a person who clearly values themselves, does not seek constant approval, and is comfortable walking away from situations that don't meet their standards, it sends a powerful signal. It suggests that being accepted by this person means something. It feels like access to a higher level of emotional and psychological space. As a result, the desire shifts from simply enjoying the interaction to wanting to be seen, chosen, and validated by that person. This is where self-worth reflection begins to shape attachment, because the interaction is no longer just about connection. It becomes tied to how someone perceives themselves through that connection. This dynamic becomes even more pronounced when there is a contrast between two individuals. If one person is constantly seeking reassurance, overgiving, or trying to prove their value, while the other remains grounded, selective, and emotionally stable, the imbalance creates a strong pull. The person with lower expressed self-worth starts to look at the other as a reference point. They begin to measure themselves against that standard, often unconsciously. This can lead to increased effort, heightened emotional sensitivity, and a stronger desire to gain approval. What feels like attraction on the surface is often a deeper psychological attempt to close the gap between how they see themselves and how they perceive the other person. Self-worth reflection also influences how people interpret behavior. When someone with strong self-worth gives attention, it is perceived as intentional and meaningful because it is not given freely to everyone. Their approval carries more weight because it appears selective. On the other hand, when someone who lacks boundaries gives the same level of attention, it often feels less significant, even if the effort is greater. The difference is not in the action itself, but in what that action represents. One reflects choice and standards, while the other reflects availability and need. People are naturally more drawn to what feels like a choice because it reinforces the idea that they have earned a place rather than simply occupied it. Another layer of self-worth reflection is how it affects emotional stability within the dynamic. A person who values themselves does not react impulsively to every change in behavior, does not chase clarity when it is not given, and does not compromise their standards to maintain connection. This creates a sense of groundedness that others can feel. It reduces emotional volatility and replaces it with consistency of character, even if availability is not constant. That combination, emotional steadiness paired with selective investment, creates a dynamic where the other person becomes more aware of their own behavior, more conscious of how they are perceived, and more invested in maintaining a positive reflection. Over time, this reflection becomes part of the attraction itself. It's not just about liking the person, it's about liking who you feel you are when you are around them, or who you believe you could become by being chosen by them. This is why self-worth is not just an internal trait, but an external influence. It shapes the entire emotional environment of the interaction, guiding how effort is distributed, how value is perceived, and how attachment forms through the continuous exchange of identity and validation between two people. Emotional independence is one of the most attractive and misunderstood traits in human behavior because it operates quietly, without the need for explanation or display. It is not about being distant, cold, or unavailable. It is about being internally stable, regardless of external circumstances. A person who is emotionally independent does not rely on constant reassurance, validation, or attention to feel secure. Their mood, their sense of self, and their direction in life are not easily influenced by how others behave toward them. This creates a grounded presence that feels both calm and powerful because there is no sense of urgency, pressure, or neediness behind their actions. People can sense when someone is emotionally self-sufficient, and that sense alone changes the entire dynamic of attraction. When someone depends heavily on others for emotional stability, their behavior becomes reactive. Small changes in tone, delayed responses, or shifts in attention can trigger overthinking and insecurity. This often leads to behaviors like over-texting, seeking constant clarity, or trying to control the situation to regain a sense of certainty. These actions, even when driven by genuine feelings, create emotional pressure. That pressure is felt by the other person, and over time it reduces attraction because it signals dependency. In contrast, emotional independence removes that pressure entirely. There is no attempt to force outcomes, no need to chase reassurance, and no urgency to fix every fluctuation in the interaction. This absence of pressure creates space, and that space allows attraction to develop naturally rather than being pushed or managed. Another reason emotional independence is magnetic is because it introduces a balance of security and challenge at the same time. The security comes from emotional stability, knowing that the person is not unpredictable in their reactions, not overly sensitive to minor changes, and not easily shaken. The challenge comes from the fact that they are not easily influenced or controlled. Their feelings are not something that can be quickly secured through minimal effort. This combination creates a dynamic where the other person feels safe engaging with them, but also aware that their presence and attention are not guaranteed. That awareness increases focus, effort, and emotional investment because the interaction feels meaningful rather than automatic. Emotional independence also reflects a deeper level of self-respect. It shows that a person values their own time, energy, and emotional well-being enough not to compromise them for temporary validation. They do not abandon their priorities, neglect their goals, or adjust their standards just to maintain someone's interest. This consistency in behavior sends a clear message. Their life is full, their identity is stable, and their sense of worth does not fluctuate based on external approval. When people encounter this, it naturally elevates the perceived value of the individual because their attention appears intentional rather than necessary. Being chosen by someone who does not need you carries more weight than being needed by someone who lacks stability. There is also a psychological effect tied to how emotional independence shapes perception over time. When someone is not constantly seeking connection, their presence becomes more noticeable when it does occur. Interactions feel more deliberate, more focused, and more meaningful. The absence of constant availability creates contrast, and that contrast strengthens emotional impact. People begin to associate the person with a sense of calm, clarity, and control, which stands out in a world where many interactions are driven by urgency and emotional fluctuation. This distinct presence becomes memorable, and memory plays a key role in building long-term attraction and attachment. Emotional independence does not mean a lack of care or interest. It means that care is given from a place of choice rather than need. It allows someone to engage fully without losing themselves in the process, to connect without becoming dependent, and to walk away without feeling diminished. This level of internal control reshapes how others respond because it removes the usual patterns of emotional negotiation and replaces them with clarity and stability. As a result, the interaction feels less like something that needs to be managed and more like something that is naturally valuable, simply because of the way it is experienced in the presence of someone who is fully in control of themselves. The pull of unfinished emotional experiences comes from the mind's natural resistance to incomplete patterns. Human psychology is wired to seek resolution, clarity, and closure, especially in emotionally significant situations. When a connection ends without a clear emotional conclusion, without understanding, without mutual acknowledgement, or without a sense of finality, it leaves a psychological gap. That gap doesn't just disappear over time, it stays active in the background, quietly demanding attention. The mind continues to revisit the interaction, replay conversations, and search for meaning in what happened. This ongoing mental activity creates a form of attachment that is not based solely on the quality of the relationship, but on the absence of closure within it. When emotions are fully expressed and resolved, the brain is able to categorize the experience and move forward. But when something is left open-ended, mixed signals, sudden distance, or a connection that felt promising but never fully developed, the emotional process remains incomplete. This creates what can be described as a loop where the person keeps returning to the same thoughts and questions. What did I miss? What could I have done differently? Was it real? These questions are not just casual reflections. They become repetitive patterns that keep the other person mentally and emotionally present. The more often the mind returns to these questions, the stronger the sense of attachment becomes, even if the actual interaction was limited or inconsistent. This effect is intensified by the emotional contrast within the experience. When a connection includes moments of strong engagement, attention, chemistry, shared understanding, and then suddenly shifts into distance or silence, it creates a sharp imbalance. The brain remembers the high points and struggles to reconcile them with the sudden absence. This contrast amplifies the perceived value of those moments, making them feel more significant than they might have been in a more stable, predictable dynamic. The person becomes focused on regaining that feeling or understanding why it disappeared, which further deepens the psychological investment. Unfinished emotional experiences also tap into a person's sense of identity and self-perception. When something ends without clarity, it often leads to internal questioning rather than external acceptance. Instead of simply recognizing that the connection did not continue, the mind tries to interpret what it says about them. This can create a subtle link between the unresolved situation and their sense of worth, making it harder to let go. The desire for closure then becomes not just about understanding the other person, but about restoring a sense of internal balance. This added layer makes the attachment more persistent because it is tied to both the relationship and the individual's self-concept. Another important aspect is how absence interacts with memory. When a connection is incomplete, the mind tends to idealize the parts that were positive while leaving the negative or unclear aspects unresolved. Without a clear ending, there is no definitive point where the experience is fully processed. Instead, it remains open to interpretation, often becoming more emotionally charged over time. This can lead to a situation where the person feels more attached after the connection has ended than they did while it was active, simply because their mind continues to engage with it in an attempt to complete the narrative. This dynamic explains why people often feel pulled back towards someone who did not provide consistent attention or a clear ending. The return is not always driven by genuine compatibility or long-term potential, but by the need to resolve the unfinished emotional experience. The interaction becomes less about the present reality and more about closing the psychological loop that was left open. As long as that loop remains unresolved, the connection maintains a level of influence, continuing to draw attention, thought, and emotional energy back toward it repeatedly. Respect is a foundational driver of attraction because it shapes how people perceive value, boundaries, and long-term potential within a connection. While attention can create temporary interest, it does not sustain attraction on its own. Attention is easy to give and easy to receive, which makes it common and, over time, less impactful. When someone consistently offers attention without discernment, constant messaging, immediate availability, and a willingness to prioritize another person at all times, it begins to lose significance. The interaction may feel pleasant in the moment, but it does not build depth or lasting intrigue. Respect, on the other hand, is earned through behavior that signals self-control, standards, and a clear sense of identity, and this is what gives attraction a stable foundation. One of the key differences between attention and respect is how they are perceived over time. Attention satisfies an immediate emotional need, providing validation and a sense of being wanted. However, when it is given too freely, it can create familiarity without value. The other person becomes accustomed to receiving it, and instead of appreciating it more, they begin to expect it. This expectation reduces its emotional impact because there is no effort required to maintain it. Respect operates differently because it is tied to boundaries and consistency rather than frequency. When someone demonstrates that their time, energy, and emotional investment are not unlimited, it creates a sense of structure within the interaction. That structure signals that access to them is not automatic, and this naturally increases the perceived value of their presence. Respect is also closely connected to how a person handles themselves in uncertain or challenging situations. When someone maintains composure, does not overreact to changes, and does not compromise their standards to keep someone interested, it reinforces the idea that they are grounded and self-assured. This stability becomes attractive because it suggests reliability without dependency. It shows that the person is not easily influenced by external factors and that their behavior is guided by internal principles rather than momentary emotions. In contrast, when someone prioritizes attention over self-respect, chasing reassurance, tolerating inconsistent treatment, or overextending themselves to maintain connection, it can signal insecurity even if their intentions are genuine. Another important aspect is how respect influences emotional dynamics. When respect is present, interactions feel balanced. Both individuals recognize boundaries, value each other's time, and engage without a sense of pressure or obligation. This balance allows attraction to develop in a more natural and sustainable way. Without respect, the dynamic often becomes uneven, with one person investing more effort, seeking more validation, and adjusting more frequently. This imbalance can reduce attraction because it shifts the interaction from mutual interest to one-sided pursuit. The person receiving the excess attention may not consciously analyze the situation, but they feel the difference in energy, and that feeling shapes their level of interest over time. Respect also amplifies the meaning of attention when it is given. When someone who has clear standards and boundaries chooses to invest their time and focus, it feels intentional rather than routine. Their attention carries weight because it is not something they distribute indiscriminately. This selective engagement creates a stronger emotional response, as it signals that the interaction is based on genuine interest rather than habit or need. The same action, sending a message, spending time together, showing interest, can have completely different effects depending on whether it is backed by respect or driven by a need for validation. Over time, respect becomes the factor that determines whether attraction grows or fades. Attention can initiate connection, but without respect, it struggles to maintain it. Respect reinforces the idea that the interaction has value beyond immediate emotional gratification, and that it is built on a foundation of self-awareness and discipline. This is what creates lasting interest, because it combines emotional engagement with a sense of stability and purpose, shaping how both individuals perceive the connection and their role within it. Attraction grows when you stop needing it. The more you rely on someone for validation, the less they value your presence. But when you stay grounded, control your emotions, and prioritize your own life, your value becomes clear without explanation. Focus on yourself. Build discipline, keep your standards. That's what changes everything.